So a figure like Joe Rogan, who's anti-institutional, anti-establishment, he can play with religion, he can play with Christianity, and that actually fits well with his brand. Peterson is wonderful at encouraging people to take responsibility, carry your cross up the goddamn hill, but he's missing, he doesn't grasp the nettle of the gospel. I think people need to find better heroes. And I worry about people who've made Donald Trump their hero. I think Trump looks out for Trump. The pronouns, all of that sort of stuff began to wake people up to go, hang on, what are you doing? What are you saying? No, I'm not going to just continue playing make-believe. I'm not going to play along with this game that we all know is a game. It's really not possible, I think, to be a consistent Christian and socially left. I don't think you can be a Christian and be pro-abortion. I don't think you can be a Christian consistently and be for the redefinition of marriage. These things, I think, are inextricably bound up with Christian morals, Christian doctrine.
Bethel McGrew is an American writer and cultural critic. She's written for First Things, for The Critic, for World Magazine, and National Review. She has a PhD in pure mathematics and writes regularly on her Substack, Further Up. Terrific to talk to you. Can you just, at the outset, let us know how we gain access to your Substack?
Yeah, you can just type in www.furtherup.net. And a lot of my content is free, but a lot of it I reserve for paid subscribers. So my current rate is $40 a year, $5 a month. I think it's a good investment. Not that I'm biased, but that's where you can find it.
Could I begin by saying I'm always terrified of somebody who has a degree in pure mathematics, because that's the ultimate sort of science degree, really, isn't it? Where did you do that?
I did that at Western Michigan University, which is in Kalamazoo, the little town where I grew up in Michigan. And so I did both my undergraduate and graduate degrees there. And to be honest with you, I was surprised myself that I ended up doing a degree in mathematics, because literature, the humanities, were really my first loves. But then I thought perhaps I could find a little more academic security doing a degree in something STEMmy. And so I decided to give it a go and see how that went, and discovered I was good enough to do a doctorate, but not actually good enough to forge a research mathematics career. So then eventually I realized I could make a living writing, and that's what I'm doing now. You're probably enough.
Well, we do live in an age of great debate. This is an age of ferment over ideas, philosophies, religion versus non-religion. And you're right in the thick of it. And I'm intrigued that you describe yourself, I think, as a Christian humanist. When I think of a humanist, I tend to think of the Richard Dawkinses or even the Bertrand Russells of life, who really would describe themselves as atheists, but then say they were humanists because they care about people. What's a Christian humanist? What do you mean by describing yourself in that way?
Well, the word humanism has many connotations, as you say, including explicitly anti-religious, anti-Christian ones. But I would say that a different way to think of humanism, to define humanism at its best, is it's a recognition of the inherent value of the human person, that the human person has dignity, free will, responsibility, that we're more than a sack of chemicals, we're more than a bundle of Freudian neuroses. So you mentioned figures like Dawkins or Russell, but I would also think of figures like Viktor Frankl, for instance, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning and helped usher in, you could say, the humanist wave of psychology. And I think the presumptions that really grounded Frankl's work in the end were religious, even though his project was functionally secular. So I think humanism at its best steals from Christianity, or at least steals from theism. So Christianity today is really, in part, a process of stealing humanism back, because I believe Christianity is the true humanism. So that's why I call myself a Christian humanist.
You recently wrote of Professor Jordan Peterson as a man who has, and I'm quoting here, single-handedly galvanized numerous young people into serious engagement with Scripture and the Christian faith. That's an interesting observation for you to make. I agree with it, by the way, but I'd love you to talk a bit about that. It strikes me as amazing that the person who's most talking about matters of faith today is not actually an ordained man or a great evangelist like a Billy Graham or whatever. It's a clinical psychologist from Canada.
Well, and I mean, of course, I would never want to disparage, the millions of theologians and pastors who are working in obscurity. And I tend to think really that's often where you find the best people away from the spotlight. They don't have large public platforms. They're just working faithfully, and maybe they lack public speaking skills or whatever, so they don't have a massive platform to broadcast, but that doesn't mean they aren't there and working. But Peterson was a singular figure, no question, a man with singular gifts. Not an original thinker necessarily. A lot of people have noted how he really synthesizes and blends together a lot of other thinkers, but he had a unique ability to convey that to people today, especially young people. And it hit differently, the message to take religion seriously, take the Bible seriously. It hit differently coming from an outsider like Peterson. If your pastor or your mother says you should read the Bible, they're supposed to say that, right? That's expected. But for somebody like Peterson, who had gravitas, authority, a degree, for him to say, take this seriously, it made people sit up and notice. And he delivered that message passionately, earnestly, with a lot of care for his audience. And he made them feel like he was inviting them on a grand adventure, on their own personal hero's journey, you could say. And so that resonated really strongly with people who kind of desperately needed that sort of voice in their lives.
I agree with you that he is essentially a very compassionate man. You can't spend any time with him without realizing he's very sincere in his concern for others. And even via the medium, so, when you look at somebody on a television screen, it's really an electronic take on them, so to speak. But even via that medium, I think it comes through. And I think that might be part of why he touches people, do you think?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, his gifts don't really lie in writing. If you read a book of his and you compare it with him giving a lecture, the lecture is by far more compelling. So, the fact that we live in a new media age, an age of YouTube, right, where he could just put the lectures out there, they would gain millions and millions of views, definitely made him what he is. I don't think he could have made the splash that he did in a different media age.
I mention it deliberately for a number of reasons, not least of all because I think it's true and he deserves credit because he does care. But it's also because to those who would want to criticize or nitpick or disparage Jordan Peterson, I've often thought to myself, and I've said to a couple of them as a matter of fact, when you can demonstrate you care as much for your fellow men and women as Jordan Peterson does, perhaps you'll be in a position where I could take you a bit more seriously when you want to have a go at him.
Yeah, I agree with that. And reading around the different reviews of his latest book, I have obviously my own criticisms of his work in general and the latest book in particular. But a lot of people are, like you say, they're kind of concerned to nitpick, and there's a kind of a smug tone that attends that kind of thing, or that they'll come at it from a politically leftist angle, and they'll try to claim he's, I don't know, a misogynist or whatever. And it's like you're saying, it's very cynical. And I think one of Peterson's great strengths is his complete lack of cynicism. He's making earnestness great again. And that's something that's really needed, I think, in an age when young people are inclined to be cynical. Young people are inclined to make everything a joke, right? And here comes this guy to remind everybody that life is not a joke, man. Life is serious. And you're going to have to learn how to face it and face what life brings you with integrity and with responsibility.
At the risk of repeating myself on my own show, I haven't made these observations for quite a while, but my first serious encounter with him, watching him with a group of people, was in Australia. And he walked on to the stage, 1,000 people. I was asked to MC the night. And I looked out across the audience and realised a staggering proportion of them were young men. He got a standing ovation before he'd said a word. And I remember thinking, as a former politician, I've never seen a serving politician get this sort of welcome. And online, it's a different world. They knew who he was. And you're right. He addressed those people with great respect. And I think those young men were recognising that life, they had recognised life's serious because they felt under attack. And he nailed it. He said the culture wants to attack you, as young men in particular, as being toxic simply because you're a young man.
Yeah, that's true. And you can tell in the interview that you did with him, he was especially moved thinking about the plight of young men these days and how they're being beaten down with these messages about the toxicity of their natural masculinity. And so you can tell that he's deeply, deeply concerned about that and deeply worried to help them reclaim the goodness of manhood and to figure out their masculine identities and how that can be courageous, it can be heroic, and it can be beautiful if harnessed correctly. And we really lack voices emphasizing that now.
He was very blunt with them that evening. I don't think he'd mind me saying, and I don't think I'm misrepresenting it, but he basically said, before you go out and try and save the world with whatever cause it might happen to be or whatever, you need to engage in some self-examination. You need to retreat to your bedroom and not just tidy it up. You need to tidy yourself up. You need to have a long, hard look at yourself. You're not as good as you ought to be. In fact, the more honest you are, the more you realise you fall short. Face all that. Find a reconciliation, pull your shoulders back before you go out and try and change the world.
Well, that's true.
They loved it. I mean, because you got a standing ovation at the beginning. You got another one at the end. I was amazed by this. And then we had half an hour for questions. And they gave him a third standing ovation. And I thought to myself, to the knockers, that's an Australian term, the cynics, the people who want to just say it doesn't matter, you're out of touch. There's something very big happening here. We've let younger people fall into a world where they are not in the best of places and they're looking for something better. And I think we owe him credit for opening up an opportunity to at least talk about things that were being shut down. Always dangerous to shut things down when people need to talk.
Yeah, agreed. And I think also you touched on something else that is refreshing and surprising, and also surprising that it resonated so much with people, but the call to self-examination. I think about G.K. Chesterton writing into the newspaper, put out the question, what's wrong with the world?
You're in London. We're in London. That it happened here. It was the Times. The Times.
That was it. The Times. And Chesterton just wrote, I am. Now, actually, the story might be apocryphal. I hope it's true. But I think Peterson, in his way, was saying what Chesterton is said to have asserted there, which is you are actually the problem. It's not everybody else. And I think that was a real shift from the new atheists, right? Because the new atheists had a glibness, and it was all about telling you know better than God, right? You know better than your parents. Whereas Peterson comes along and he says, actually, you might be part of what's wrong with the world, not necessarily, because you're a young man, but just because you're not perfect. You all have flaws. You all have things you need to work on and examine. But you have the capacity to do that, and you have the potential. So it wasn't just discouraging. It was criticizing with the ultimate goal of building up. And that's what made him so effective.
I remember on the night realizing that a lot of the young Australians in that audience were appreciating his authenticity and his willingness to be vulnerable. And I actually resolved that night that for the rest of my life, I would try and make myself vulnerable, because I saw young people looking for things that were real and that could be grasped. I suppose because in your terms, what you just said, they know things are serious and they feel they're not being taken seriously. They're being, if you know, to put it one way, offered thin gruel when they're looking for a solid steak.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, again, going back to the New Atheists, a lot of what the New Atheists offered was pretty thin gruel. So with Peterson, that was their first taste of steak. And I think that's why people began moving away from a New Atheist approach to things like religion or the Bible, and towards a greater openness and greater seriousness.
It's interesting that you say that, because in one sense, I remember thinking when the new atheism emerged, there's nothing new about this at all.
Yeah.
It's the old atheism. Actually, in many cases, the new atheists, I think, were pretty lightweight compared to the early atheists. I'm not somebody who would claim to be on the same philosophical and intellectual level as some of them, as many of them, but I remember at university studying the 19th century atheists and how, particularly after Darwin, they sought to build sociological and political lessons out of evolution, the ugliest of them, of course, resulting in fascism, survival of the fittest, the Nazis, and so forth, loved that sort of line of thinking. So there was nothing new in a way about new atheism, and it does seem it's peaked, and it's peaked largely because they couldn't offer a better way to live. You know, how then might we live, as Colson would have put it, if there's no God? They were not really able to come up with a code, were they?
Yeah, exactly. And what's interesting to me about Peterson is that he's a marginal figure. He sort of, that's his own word for himself, I exist on the margins. So he himself personally feels like he can't commit to the Christian faith. And when you see him interacting with somebody like Richard Dawkins, I think they really share a lot of presuppositions in common, maybe ultimately about how things actually are, how the world is actually constituted. But as you say, Peterson is asking that question of, okay, but how now shall we live? So great, you took away people's comfort, you took away people's security, you took away the thing in which they found meaning. What's your plan now for what they should do? And Dawkins would say, well, it's none of my business. That's for them to figure out. I'm just here to say true things. And I think there's something to be said for truth's sake. And in that sense, you could say maybe I'm actually a little bit sympathetic to Dawkins. But the questions that Peterson is asking are completely legitimate as well. And he's certainly correct that the new atheists never bothered to try to offer any kind of serious substitute, any serious program for meaningful living.
My understanding is that many of them did. They recognized that was a weakness, but they weren't able to do it. I mean, how do you?
Yeah, well, I mean, you could try to do what Sam Harris does, and I think that's why Peterson tried to engage some more with Harris at the beginning, because, Harris will try to sort of cobble together his little moral system based on well-being, right? So you have more well-being over here, less well-being over there, and you can try to create a moral system based on that, but it's really very flimsy, and Peterson sussed that out right away. And so you have meditation. You can try that, I guess, but that's a pretty flimsy substitute as well. It ends in emptiness, ultimately.
One thing that I'd be interested in your views on is that there's a bit of a bifurcation taking place here, I think, that young men, it appears, are recentering. They're drifting back towards conservatism, particularly younger, Generation Z. There seems to be quite a bit of research to back this up. They're even more likely to come to church now than young women who are still drifting perhaps further to the left. And you're getting this sort of coming apart, which is, I'd be just interested in whether you think that's happening, why it might be happening. My own personal view is that in part young men are coming back because of the attacks on them. They're saying, hey, hang on. you're telling me I'm toxic and I'm a predator simply because I'm a male? I might not be perfect, but I don't think I quite warrant that writing off, this idea that there are only two classes of people. There are victims and there are victim makers, and I'm a victim maker. I'm an Andrew Tate just because I've got, testosterone in my veins. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that has made a lot of young men think again.
I agree. I think there definitely is a reactive element to that. And I mean, my own experience is just anecdotal, but I've kind of seen that borne out as well. The young men are trying to sort of push buttons and kind of maybe figure out where the line is, and shifting towards the transgressive right, where young women are likely to become entrenched on the left. So, but it's not a stable situation, obviously, because we want men and women to get along, obviously.
Well, exactly.
For society to...
Yeah, I'm not saying it's a good thing.
Yeah,
I'm saying it's a bad thing.
I agree with that. And so I think then the trick for sensible conservatives and sensible Christians is figuring out how to deliver a positive message to young men that kind of gently steers them away from the reactionary right, that steers them away from the Andrew Tates of the world, and kind of lets them know that there is a better way. You just need better heroes.
I said to a bunch of parents recently in a forum back in Australia in response to a couple of questions that were being thrown at me. I said, whether you like it out or not in this modern age now and online and what have you, you've got a couple of interesting models out there and they're very different. Choose between a Jordan Peterson who's telling your sons, particularly, it was a group of parents of sons, to be responsible. You're not who you ought to be. Pull your shoulders back. Don't live immorally. And then you've got Andrew Tate as the alternative. Which one do you choose? And stop and think a little bit about the value of what Jordan Peterson is doing. It had quite an impact. They got the message, which was interesting. I wonder, though, talking of getting the message, do you think the churches, even the better ones, have fully understood what's happening? And have they sort of clicked on to how to message the good news, if I can put it that way, to young people who are operating in this mess of a society that we've created? There's no other way of putting it. We're talking about how Jordan Peterson has reached so many of them. So many of them see him as a sort of an uncle figure. Essentially, I think you and I would be keen for people to take that next step and to be reached for faith or by faith. But it's not happening so well out of the churches today. Are they missing something? Where are they getting it wrong? Or am I misunderstanding them? Maybe many of them are getting it right.
That's a good question. Of course, Peterson did put out this video as a message to the churches where he was trying to sort of give advice of what they could change, what they could do differently. And not all of it was bad advice per se, but I do feel like Peterson perhaps doesn't understand the church as well as he could. And the church actually has had its figures and its phases, and people writing books and conferences and stuff like that, even specifically things designed to appeal to men. I think you see that especially in evangelicalism, which has always kind of tried to pride itself on engaging the culture, understanding the times, all that stuff. So, in a way, you can even find kind of analogs to Peterson in evangelical world. But I think a large part of Peterson's appeal was the very fact that he was an outsider. And so obviously that's not something, by definition, that's not something the church can replicate. That's not something any pastor can replicate. The pastor is who he is, and Peterson is who he is. And so, in a way, I think you kind of need, for some people, they need a figure like Peterson to be a kind of pre-evangelion, to be a gateway drug, so to speak, is a less fancy way of putting that, gets them in the door. But then I think happily, what does happen in many cases is that then those young people do begin seriously looking at churches, and they do find a pastor or a priest or somebody who can guide them along past Peterson. And then they look back and they're grateful for Peterson. They see what he did for them, but now they understand really better than he does, and they hope that now he can follow them.
That adds up to me. There is some early research in my country, and I think certainly in the United States, suggesting that the continual drifting away from Christian faith is finally slowing, and that there may be a reversal amongst younger people now, more people coming back.
I would hope so. And I mean, anecdotally, I can definitely attest to that. I literally just in my hometown at a Christmas party, I met a young man who's a very passionate, devout Catholic now, but he says it was Peterson who got him in the door a few years ago. And, he had a very complicated, non-religious background, but then Peterson got him reading the Bible. And so now, here he is. So, I do have hope that, through figures like Peterson and maybe somewhat Tom Holland in the UK, kind of trends that Justin Brierley talks about in his book, I have hope that there's some revival around the corner. Now these things go up and down, there's seasons to them. But I live in hope.
Interestingly, you make that comment that young man found Jordan Peterson was the gateway to him finding his own personal faith. He wasn't the person who nailed it for him. And I think that raises the interesting question about where Jordan Peterson really fits.
Yeah, I agree. And I think Peterson is wonderful at encouraging people to take responsibility, carry your cross up the goddamn hill, all that. But he's missing, he doesn't grasp the nettle of the gospel at the end of the day. And that's the missing ingredient, because I think when Peterson sees Christ on the cross, he sees the perfect man. He sees the archetypal, tragic human tragedy, right? And he believes that's something that we should strive to imitate. But of course, the thing about Jesus on the cross is that it wasn't just the perfect man on the cross, it was God on the cross. It was God reaching down to man. And Peterson struggles to see the difference between man reaching towards the divine and the divine reaching down to man. I think that really came out in his discussion with Richard Dawkins. So that's something I hope that Peterson realizes for himself, and it may take some more time. I don't think he's really tumbled to it yet. But the young people who got in the church door through him and then kept going, they are the ones who now have grasped that nettle of the gospel, and now I hope he follows them.
Interesting, isn't it? I mean, the title of his book, We Who Wrestle with God, implies that there's still wrestling, whereas the young man you're talking about is no longer wrestling.
Right. Well, and I mean, now I do think we all go through an ongoing process of wrestling with God. We all have our seasons of doubt and darkness as Christians. And so I wouldn't want to tell Christians that once you're in, that's it. You're never going to have seasons of doubt or wrestling. But in a sense, that young man and other young men like him, their wrestling is done in the Augustinian sense. Our hearts are restless until we find our rest in thee. And I see Peterson as a very restless man, fundamentally. I don't think his heart has found rest yet.
Now, something that I think it's fair to say that a lot of conservatives, particularly evangelical conservatives, are wrestling with right now is the whole question of Donald Trump. And interestingly, Wheaton College, a theological college in America, for those who are not familiar with it, all but retracted a tweet congratulating one of its alumni who'd been appointed to the Trump administration. It's a reflection of the uncertainty, I think, as well as the division in evangelical circles. Overwhelmingly, it appears that evangelicals have supported Trump. Critics of Christians would say, thought you people thought character was everything and he fails the character test. You should have leaders who have character. And yet plainly many evangelicals thought, well, the alternatives also fail the character test and have formed a different set of judgments, presumably around the idea that he will be friendlier to faith and better for governance than some of the other people that they also felt failed that character test.
Right. Well, we have, as you say, we've moved past that character matters era, which, by the way, Democrats and Republicans alike used to agree on. This didn't used to be a partisan thing, and then that really began to change with Clinton, I would say. And then by the time Trump came along, everyone had just sort of left that idea behind. I personally think it's a good idea. I think character does matter. People should try to be consistent. At the same time, I don't have Trump derangement syndrome. I don't go around bashing people who decided that Trump was the lesser of two evils, because I could see their reasoning. Somebody referred to Trump's first election as a Flight 93 election. Look, here's all the terrible things the Democrats are going to do. This is the lesser of two evils. You have to just take control and take the hand that you're dealt. But I think the danger is that a lot of people have convinced themselves that Trump is something he's not necessarily. I think they've convinced themselves that maybe he's more conservative than he actually is. He's going to have conservatives back, when I'm not sure that's true. I don't think he's fundamentally trustworthy necessarily. I think Trump looks out for Trump. And sometimes it might be in Trump's interests to do things conservatives like. He did give us the justices who overturned Roe versus Wade. Obviously, that's a win. That's something to celebrate. And now here in the first few weeks of his second term, he's signed a number of good executive orders. He's pardoned pro-life prisoners. These are all good things. Obviously, he has good people in his ear. He has a good team assembled around him. But at the end of the day, I think this is like what I was saying about young men who are tending towards the right. I think people need to find better heroes. And I worry about people who've made Donald Trump their hero. Now, you mentioned Wheaton College and them retracting that tweet congratulating their alumnus. I thought that was really cowardly. A lot of people did. And I think that bespeaks a divide within evangelicalism between what you might call the evangelical managerial class and the evangelicals in the pew. And it's almost a kind of class divide, you might say, and it sort of reflects the divide in the country writ large. That you've got the evangelicals who are kind of self-appointed gatekeepers. They see it as their job to tell people what to think, how to vote, how to be respectable. Then the people in the pews really resent that. And so a vote for Trump, in their mind, is a vote against the evangelical managerial class, against the school marms, against the scolds. And I have no patience with school marms and scolds myself. But I think we need a better philosophy of politics. We need a better philosophy of voting than just whatever is going to make the scolds mad, you know.
You raised something that I would like to follow up on. The idea that there was an era during the Clinton era, time when people sort of started to accept, I suppose you'd say, that office holders, the people who held the office of president, wouldn't always behave as well as they might have liked. That's significant in America, isn't it? Because there was a great reverence, even if you hadn't voted for whoever was in the office at the time, for that office. Very, very deep respect for the office holder. And that's broken down. And that's sort of indicative, it's a problem right across the Western world, of this loss of confidence and faith in the democratic process and the players therein.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you saw that with January 6th, which, people had all kinds of opinions about that. It's very sharp debate. But it was definitely indicative, as you say, of this deep lack of faith, this deep lack of trust in the process, a lack of faith in institutions, in the establishment. And of course, I don't mean to condone January 6th at all. I think that was deeply unwise. But, it's a symptom. It's a symptom of a real festering sore at the heart of American society. And I don't see an easy way to fix it, except over time to slowly try to restore trust.
Well, that would require people that were palpably, obviously trustworthy.
Exactly. Yeah. And I have faith that at least some of Trump's cabinet appointees can help restore that. I think a good example would be Jay Bhattacharya, who's the incoming director of the National Institute of Health. I think with COVID and Francis Collins in that position, Collins rightly earned a lot of harsh criticism for the way that he handled the COVID crisis. And part of that was his trying to suppress alternative voices like Dr. Bhattacharya. So for Bhattacharya now to be taking his place is a real vindication, I think, and could really go a long way to restoring trust in at least the health side of things. So I am optimistic about that.
I wouldn't normally make a little plug for our conversations, but we had Jay Bhattacharya on a couple of times, actually, but the first time I wanted to hear what he had to say, and I felt people ought to hear it. And he actually said it was the first time he was taken seriously, and it opened up lots of opportunities. Let's hope this conversation opens up some opportunities for people to engage as well. So there you go. I'm not into self-promotion, but he did say that to me, and I appreciated it, and I appreciate your point that he's a good appointment.
Yes, absolutely.
You've alluded to those who think that Trump is a hero and everything he does will be good and he's got it right. And the problem with that is always that no one gets it 100% right or 100% wrong. What are your thoughts after the first few weeks? I mean, there have been some very interesting things that you've touched on that he's done that have been quite welcome.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. So obviously those are things that I appreciate. At the same time, I'm not in favor of everything he does or says. And I think one example might be the way that he's sort of bluffing about Israel and the Gaza Strip. I don't know what he has in mind there, but if he is bluffing, I think that's very unwise. And if that is a sign of how he's going to handle foreign policy in the years to come, then we're in for quite a bumpy ride. And I don't approve of bluffing as a negotiation tactic, but it seems to be one of the few things Trump knows how to do. And I think that's a real problem. Another area in which I am disappointed by Trump is social issues, social conservatism. So one of many reasons why I withheld my vote is I could see the way that he was trying to kind of remake the Republican Party in his image on certain issues. At the Republican convention, I saw how he brushed aside the more socially conservative delegates because he wanted to rewrite the platform. He wanted to water down what it said about abortion, what it said about the definition of marriage, because he believed that the country has shifted irrevocably leftward on those issues. And obviously he's thinking in terms of getting as many votes as possible. He wants to be where the majority of people in the country are at, and where people are at is pretty liberal on those things. And the people who are holding the line in a conservative way are a bit of an embarrassment to him. They're a bit of a hindrance. And so he suppressed them. And I think that makes him untrustworthy for people who really take social conservatism seriously.
As a non-American, I'm very conscious that the so-called liberal global order that has given us a degree of peace and certainty since the end of the Second World War, a long time ago now, is really there because America's been the global policeman. I worry that the president, with his understandable America First approach, which obviously appeals to a lot of people, make America great again, I worry that that might symbol an ongoing retreat from playing global policeman, frankly. And I can understand, I really can, why a lot of Americans would say, look what we've invested, look what we've done, look at the blood we've shed, the dollars we've put up for the benefit of others, and we never seem to be appreciated. I can understand that. I genuinely can. But on the other hand, I don't think any of us would be too excited about the global order descending into bloodshed and chaos, given the forces of autocracy that are apparently lining up, licking their lips, thinking the West had its day. It's weak, degenerated, divided. And there are some major bad actors on the stage, international stage today.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think the obvious example that comes to mind would be Russia and Ukraine. There's a lot of resentment and bitterness about American dollars going to support Ukraine. People like Tucker Carlson some might even call him a bit of a Putin stooge at this point. And I do incline somewhat towards isolationism. I don't think it's historically gone well for us to try to be the world's policeman. So I'm not as neocon as all that in that sense. I think there can be wisdom in just leaving, just pulling back, recognizing when something is a lost cause. But there's a ditch on the other side, right? Which is not recognizing who our allies are, and just completely abandoning a country like Ukraine for Putin to do whatever he wants to. And that can't be the answer either. We have to figure out the third way.
Well, America doesn't want to live in a world where it's not, I would suspect, top dog. I don't want to live in a world where America's not top dog. What do I mean by that? Well, the alternatives are fairly unattractive. Beijing is plainly intent on dominating the Pacific region, if not the world. I don't want the world to be dominated by the forces of communism. The only bulwark against it, really, frankly, is America. So these are going to be interesting times.
May you live in interesting times. So the saying goes, except it's a curse, right?
Yes, that's right. So we can't really know. It's unpredictable, I suppose. I was interested that one of the particularly notable stances of the early Trump term has been his opposition to transgenderism. And I'm really wondering whether that doesn't spell the death knell for the transgenderism movement.
Yeah, the thing about transgenderism is it's the LGBT revolution overplaying its hand, right? They could get a certain ways with gay rights, with gay marriage, and Americans had a sort of a tolerant live and let live approach to a point. And then it was the transgender stuff that really began to cross that line for people. And I mean, women's sports, the pronouns, all of that sort of stuff began to wake people up to go, hang on, what are you doing? What are you saying? No, I'm not going to just continue playing make-believe. I'm not going to play along with this game that we all know is a game. And people were able to kind of build a fairly broad coalition fighting back against that. And it's an eclectic coalition. It includes Christians and conservatives, certainly, but also gays and lesbians who resent the overreach of trans. And so there's been some interesting and maybe somewhat uneasy alliances that have formed there. I'm not sure how long those will last. But Trump has calculated correctly, I think, that by signing these executive orders, he's signing things that the majority of America is with him on, because the left has overplayed its hand here. So I do have hope that there will be a turning of the tide there. Now, what that means for LGBT in general, I'm not sure. That's an interesting question. It remains to be seen. It remains to be seen whether there's a reconsideration of Obergefell. Maybe that'll happen. I don't know. We'll see. But I think the wind is definitely at the back of the people who are against transgenderism.
Interesting, anecdotally, but these things do tell stories. Out in the middle of the Australian and country, only a matter of days ago, a man said to me, I'm not interested in politics very much. I'm just a tradie. He was being very modest. He's extremely good at what he does, but he just made the observation. He said, I'm so glad that Trump is standing up against women women being forced to accept men in their sport. And then he went on to say a very interesting thing. He said, my wife goes to the gym 2 or 3 times a week, and she says she just doesn't know what she's going to do when she walks in one day to get changed and finds there's a big hairy-bodied man there getting changed as well, claiming to be a woman.
Well,
it reaches that far. It ricochets across the world is my point. And he's a fellow who's probably never made that observation of anybody outside his family before, but he felt free to say it to me. He'd been really staggered by what had happened, thought it was incomprehensible. He felt powerless about it, but because the President of the United States has said enough is enough, he felt able to talk about it and to tell me how relieved he was.
Well, and that's the thing. And I think people who have normally considered themselves on the American left feel the same way, that they're sort of quietly, for fear of being rejected by their former leftist friends, they'll say these things to each other quietly. And so now for it to be gradually becoming mainstream and Trump is a real turning of the tide, it's an encouragement to people. One point I would make, though, is it's still conservatism without Christianity is still limited. And so if you think about the effects of transgenderism, you think about where it leads people who've had certain kinds of surgeries, who've taken certain kinds of hormones, and it wrecks them. You can't go back from that. And you have to figure out, imagine a parent who did that to her child and never wants to admit what she actually did. Where is she going to find forgiveness? Where is she going to find solace? It's similar to a woman who's had an abortion. Where is she really going to be able to lay down that burden? And Christless conservatism can't offer that to people. So it can get you a certain distance. It can, certainly help to keep the public order, create safeguarding, create laws, all of that, excellent and good stuff. But at the end of the day, it's the Christians who are going to have to really come in and help to pick up the broken pieces for people.
Interestingly, just in what you said then, should we be a little wary of equating Christianity with any political philosophy? Is it right to say Christianity is conservative? In some ways, it can be very radical. Has it been a problem in America that Christianity has become, or the Christians have become associated with one side of politics to almost the total exclusion of the other side of politics?
That's a very interesting question. Of course, the word conservative, it can be confusing because it doesn't mean the same thing in America that it means in England or that it means in Australia. So people can talk past each other, right, when they try to use these words. I think I would say, I make a distinction, and friends disagree with me about this, but I kind of make a distinction in my mind between conservative and right-wing. Definitely there are certain right-wing ideas or right-wing values that aren't Christian at all. I mean, obviously fascism is the end point of that. So, you could say a contempt for the weak, a glorification of the strong man, the melding of capitalism and vice. Now, I'm a capitalist myself, but obviously there's a dark side to capitalism. So you could have a kind of a right-wing value system that prioritizes making money above everything else, and obviously that's not Christian. So, but I do think that conservatism at its best is consonant with Christianity. That's what I would say. But I do have friends, obviously, who are to my left, and I love and respect them dearly. I would say it's really not possible, I think, to be a consistent Christian and socially left. And people may disagree with me about that, but I don't think you can be a Christian and be pro-abortion. I don't think you can be a Christian consistently and be for the redefinition of marriage. These things, I think, are inextricably bound up with Christian morals, Christian doctrine.
It just often strikes me that we need to be careful and remember that on some issues, Christianity demands quite radical positions on things. A classic example, we're in England, might be slavery. Conservatives might have argued during the anti-slavery debates, we've always done it this way. Conserve the valuable things that we have from the past. Don't rock the boat. Stay with the things that we know. You radicals are the ones saying we ought to end slavery. Well, the radicals who were wanting to end slavery were, of course, all Christians, or predominantly Christians.
That's true. And so that's where it's important to define our terms. And so conservatism, as you're defining it there, is simply an adherence to what's worked before. And you're absolutely right that, of course, Christianity in that sense can be extremely radical. The early church was extremely radical. It was a rebellion against the Roman custom of abandoning infants, right? So
which were, by the way, overwhelmingly female infants.
That's right. That's right. And
it was a blow, a strike for equality.
That's right. Yeah. And the Christian message was of universal dignity for all, male and female, slave and free. Right. That's the Christian message. So you're absolutely right that Christianity can come as a radical, in that sense, liberalizing clarion call. So in that sense, you could say that being pro-life it's very subversive. It's very radical in a society that's become complacent about abortion, where abortion is the status quo. I think in America, the word conservative just tends to be associated with a certain cluster of positions on things. So the word conservative is associated with just being pro-life. But depending on how you define conservative, that can vary depending on the context.
Important in countries like mine, where the understanding of conservative might be a bit different and is often seen by young people as meaning we're resistant to change. And it's good to restlessly look around for areas that can be improved. And I suppose this is a quirky thing to say, but I think there are times when conservatives should be prepared to be thinking outside the square in no uncertain terms and looking for very different solutions to problems. A true conservative, I think, will look for good solutions where things are not going as well as they should be going. It's not about always, I'm sure you agree with this, it's just to make the point it's about defining terms, that it's not always about simply maintaining the status quo.
Absolutely not.
The key to conservatism, to my way of thinking in many ways, is a conservative always recognises that human nature is constant. We don't change. We're all a mixture of good and bad. We always will be. You won't fix every problem by fixing institutions. The problem lies within the individual, every one of us.
Yes, and not just the individual, but individuals coming together in community, because we are fundamentally relational creatures. No man is an island. So it's the community of the church, I would say, ultimately has to step in and do things that government can't do.
The pro-life movement that you touched on, in many ways, the Democrats ran on a platform of, as they put it, protecting women's rights to abortions in the last campaign. It didn't save them, but it has been very controversial because of the overturning of Roe versus Wade, which is not broadly understood outside America and perhaps even inside America. The Supreme Court's decision was not so much one that went to the rightness or the wrongness, if I can put it that way, of abortion, but to who should make the decisions. It was to return it to the political process. That happened automatically in Australia because it was made politically by politicians who are then accountable to the people, whereas judges are not. How is that playing out now in America? It doesn't seem to have had quite the bite during the recent presidential campaign that the Democrats assumed it would.
That is true. The Democrats really campaigned hard on that issue, and they just assumed that it would carry Kamala Harris to victory, and obviously that did not happen. That being said, I do think the pro-life movement finds itself in a tricky position now, because I think a lot of people really didn't expect Roe versus Wade to be overturned. And they had spent so many years on the defensive, that to suddenly be flung into this new landscape where it was now up to the states in some sense, it was a new world. And it's going to require a kind of a rethinking of strategy going forward and a really continuing to put in the work to change culture, to change hearts and minds. Because, the dispiriting fact is that abortion is quite popular, even in so-called red states. If you go state by state, you see how the people are voting. Overwhelmingly, consistently, people want abortion. And so conservatives, pro-lifers have to sit with that. They kind of have to reckon with that, not necessarily blaming themselves. I think there's an information war, and I'm afraid that the left has sown a lot of misinformation. They've claimed that pro-life laws are making it hard for women to receive proper care if they have complicated pregnancies, and if women die, they'll try to blame pro-life legislation for it. And it's really quite a pernicious misinformation campaign. And so Christians are going to have to fight back against that. They're going to have to assert that, no, this law is good. It does save lives, and it's best for the child. It's best for the woman. And, it's going to require courage. It's going to require people just kind of standing their ground and then taking that fight to a more local level. And in a way, this is where the work begins. It's not where the work ends.
Yeah, I must say, it's extraordinary to me that you could have in one country a set of circumstances where in some parts of the country you can effectively abort a baby right up to the time of birth. In other parts of the country, it's virtually totally illegal.
Yeah, that's the United States. You never know. It's, are you Texas or are you California? And of course, we had dramatic stories about women traveling across state lines. And of course, the left manipulated that. They love to kind of use those stories and paint pro-lifers and conservatives in as terrible a light as possible. And that's where we just have to fight back and use all the resources at our disposal.
So I had a lady in Australia telling me that Trump was terrible because he was going to ban abortion in a way that meant that a woman with an ectopic, is that how you pronounce it?
Ectopic.
Ectopic pregnancy couldn't receive help. Well, firstly, it's a state matter, as I understand it in America. Wouldn't have had anything to do with the presidential campaign. Secondly, it seems beyond belief that you couldn't receive medical assistance or a termination if you had that particular problem, as I understand it.
Yeah, that exception is, even in Texas law, even in very, conservative red state laws, that's just assumed as an exception.
Abortion essentially is a state-by-state matter. It was returned to the politicians. They're accountable to the people. If the people in that state want or don't want a position here, ultimately it's in the hands of the political process rather than the courts. That was the essential result of the overturning of Roe versus Wade. It does raise the issue, though, that I understand a lot of abortions now are really self-administered via a pill, and that's not controlled by the states.
Right. And I would say actually the majority of abortions are chemically induced via the abortion pill. And that's something that women can just do themselves at home, and they can order it through the mail. And mail, of course, across state lines, that's interstate commerce, and that falls within the purview of the federal government. And I'm concerned that Trump and Vance aren't prepared to be proactively pro-life in the sense that they're willing to regulate that kind of commerce, because that is something they could do if they wanted to. But last summer, they both clearly made statements signaling that they wouldn't oppose the abortion pill. They believed that a certain Supreme Court ruling had found a right for women to have the pill, which wasn't actually true. That was a misrepresentation of what the ruling was. So that's another area where I think this administration is not necessarily going to fight for truly committed, dedicated pro-lifers. That's something that we're going to have to do on our own. And I don't know where J.D. Vance is going to fall in all of this, because currently I think Vance is in Trump's shadow, so to speak. He kind of has to say whatever Trump says. And I'll be interested to see, because presumably Vance will be the candidate once Trump is gone. I'll be interested to see Vance come into his own as a politician, and whether perhaps with Trump out, Vance will feel more free to speak his own mind, particularly on the pro-life issue.
You mentioned Justin Brierley, and I've had the opportunity to talk to him about his book, about the way in which he's noted people moving away from new atheism or indifference, a vibe shift, I think you called it, your term for what he was describing, an openness and even a willingness to come back to faith. Are you picking that up in your own culture?
Yeah, I think Brierley is definitely onto something real. And I think it's not only public intellectuals being more friendly to Christianity and sort of replacing the new atheists in that sense, but it's also just ordinary people. And we've discussed that with young people and younger men who are coming to the church through Jordan Peterson. And I think one factor to think about with relation to a vibe shift is that as Christianity has faded out of the establishment, we're now in a new era where Christianity is becoming subversive again. So it can be a little bit cool. It can be a little bit punk to be Christian. The conversion testimony is on the rise, where previously the deconversion testimony was cool. And now I think part of the vibe shift is that inflection point now where to be a Christian is to be a little bit radical. It's to press back against the establishment. So a figure like Joe Rogan, who's anti-institutional, anti-establishment, he can play with religion, he can play with Christianity, and that actually fits well with his brand. So you saw that with the young apologist Wesley Huff, which really made quite a splash.
He was pretty impressive.
He's very impressive. And I don't know Wesley myself, but we actually have mutual friends in Christian apologetics world. And I was so thrilled to see him get that opportunity because apologetics is really a rather small pond in the grand scheme. There's lots of people who sort of quietly labor away. They're not really known outside a certain niche. So for Wesley to land on Rogan's radar was really extraordinary. And then I think, yeah, as you're saying, the new media effect of Rogan, that Rogan has such a wide audience now. He can just like that, with a snap of his fingers, broadcast this really substantive Christian message is really a remarkable thing. Now, as you say, of course, the internet is a double-edged sword. I think about Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. So the same medium that allows Wesley Huff to broadcast his views on Rogan is how Andrew Tate became a star, right? And Tate was able to game the algorithm in that very dark way. So there's glories and perils for sure. But I'm very pleased that somebody like Huff was able to get out there and spread the message. And I think we're entering hopefully a better era in the Christian versus atheist debate, where with the rise of the long form conversation or the long form podcast, as opposed to the sharp, quick debate stage, that Christians can have time to really unpack a proper cumulative case for their faith. Because I think the case for Christianity is best understood as a cumulative one. It's best appreciated slowly, instead of, dumped down and packaged into short little sound bites. So that's what Huff was able to deliver, because that's the nature of the Joe Rogan show, right? It's a long chat about whatever. And so I hope that signals a shift in how Christians do apologetics going forward, to sort of match that medium, the medium of the conversation versus the debate.
Just before we come to some of the really interesting work you've been doing in the area of apologetics, understandably, there might be some different ideas out there between our countries on what apologetics actually are. What do you mean when you say you're an apologist, or when we think of you as an apologist?
Yeah, and of course, the word does have a lot of negative connotations in some people's minds. Some people kind of free associate it with a rigid adherence to dogma, a failure to take scholarship seriously, prioritizing the Bible over science or anything else, right? I simply define apologetics as a defense of the Christian faith, the attempt to make common sense rigorous, to make reasonable men wish that it were true, to kind of riff on Pascal's quote, right? That's what I think apologetics does at its best. And to be sure, it can be abused, it can be misused. I don't think that the people who say they're on my side always do a very good job. And I can be quite blunt in criticizing people within my own tribe. I think that's fair and right. But I believe in the apologetic project, and I think that's what it is at its best.
Well, now, coming to your own work as an apologist, you've written a series recently, as I understand it, on the historical reliability of the four Gospels. They're the four, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the stories of the life of Christ. And I'm quite interested to ask you the question, how close to the events of Jesus' life, in your view, is the recording, or are the recordings in the Gospels?
So that's a spirited debate. Of course, scholars have various opinions on exactly when these things were written down. I would say I tend to accept the consensus dating for the Gospel of John, which is around 90 AD. And then as for the so-called synoptics, which would be Matthew, Mark, and Luke, I think you could make a case that those are all before the year AD 64. And the reason I choose that date is because that's the year that the Apostle Paul was executed in Rome. And the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts are agreed to be written by the same author. And the Book of Acts is a sequel to the Gospel of Luke. And it's designed to cover the life and travels of Paul. But it ends abruptly before Paul's execution. And so that's a reasonably strong clue that the Book of Acts is written before AD 64, which in turn pushes back the date for the Gospel of Luke. And then if you look at how Luke introduces his gospel, it's clear that he's not the first person to make an account of Jesus' life. That indicates that Matthew and Mark, in turn, are coming before Luke's gospel. So all in all, when you think about it, if you place Jesus' crucifixion in AD 33, you're looking at 2 or 3 decades at most out from Jesus' death. So I think that's a good and an interesting debate to have. However, one point I would want to make is that I don't know it's necessarily the most interesting question to ask. Because, for example, I mentioned I accept the late dating of the Gospel of John, but I don't think that makes John per se less reliable than the other Gospels just because he's late. I think it's better to just go to the text and ask whether it has internal markers of authenticity. Because, as you know, I think as anybody knows who's spoken with older people, with veterans of war, for example, who have very vivid memories of things that happened decades and decades ago, they can still be very sharp. And when I was 11 years old, I had a next door neighbor who fought in World War II. And I sat down and interviewed with him, and he shared his memories of the war. And they were extraordinarily vivid, extraordinarily sharp. And that's how I envision somebody like John. That's how I envision him delivering his memories and his gospel. So I think it's an interesting question when the Gospels were written down, but at the end of the day, I'm more interested in whether the accounts are reliable. And that kind of swings free of the dating question.
And your views on their reliability?
I think they're holistically reliable, which means I don't think it's just a matter of going bit by bit, story by story, and going, well, that story seems pretty well supported, but this other story is kind of fuzzy. We don't really know. I think you can take them as whole documents and say, taken as a whole, they're based on reliable eyewitness testimony. In the case of Matthew and John, I think you have documents that were actually written by eyewitnesses. And then Mark and Luke are rooted in witness testimony.
One of the most extraordinary aspects of those eyewitness testimonies is to these at 400. It's claimed saw the resurrected Christ.
Yeah, it's actually over 500 at a time. That comes from one of Paul's epistles. And yeah, that is an extraordinary claim. I would say myself, I don't tend to actually rest too much on that particular claim simply because we don't have that many details about what it was like. Did they see Jesus at a distance? How long was it for? These are questions I would love to ask if I knew the eyewitnesses, but of course, we don't, even though Paul did. And so what I tend to do is I tend to focus on the details of Jesus' original resurrection appearances to the apostles. And the fine-grained details, the polymodal details, it wasn't just that they experienced him in some way. We're told that they touched him, they ate with him, they had long conversations with him. We have the wonderful story of doubting Thomas, of course, where he's inviting Thomas to touch his wounds. And once you bring in all of those details, then you're in the realm of something that you just can't be honestly mistaken about. Your options really narrow. We have kind of a trilemma, sort of like what Lewis talked about with Jesus. Either Jesus was lying, or he was a lunatic, or he was who he said he was. And I think we find ourselves in a similar position with the disciples. They can't really have been honestly mistaken if these were the kinds of claims that they were making. However, I do think you need those fine-grained details. And so that's why I think it's important to go back to the reliability of the source texts. as source texts and not to limit ourselves to kind of a minimalist case, trying to use just a few facts that everybody can agree on, because I don't actually think that gets you all the way to where you need to go. And yes, that is going to involve, at a certain point, it is going to involve bucking scholarly consensus. And I think Wesley Huff was willing to do that on the Rogan show, which is part of why I was so pleased with that program. But so what? The consensus isn't always correct. And I think we need to be willing to oppose it sometimes.
So as someone with a PhD in maths, and someone who believes in the resurrection, how do you reconcile what some people would see as scientists find it hard to believe in the supernatural? The resurrection requires a belief in the supernatural. It is an extraordinary thing if it happened. It changes everything. So it's a very important question.
Yes, well, of course, the popular claim goes extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So the resurrection is an extraordinary claim. And then the assumption is, well, I'm not sure what I mean by extraordinary, but nothing you could possibly say would convince me that this actually happened. And so there's this ingrained assumption that the resurrection, or any miracle really, is inherently the least probable of all possible events. And of course, this is a very old assumption. This goes back to David Hume writing his dialogue on natural religion in the 1700s. But I think it's a failure to understand how probability theory actually works. So I won't get too technical for the audience here, but it's crucial to understand the difference between the so-called prior probability or the antecedent probability of an event before you look into the actual evidence and the probability after you've taken the evidence into account. And so I agree, it's true. The prior probability of the resurrection or of a miracle is low. There's a natural order of things in which dead men stay dead, something that the people of the Bible knew, by the way. They weren't just ignoramuses who assumed that dead people might just get up and walk anytime. That wasn't something that just happened in the normal course of events. So yeah, we have a natural order in which dead men normally stay dead. But then the question is, okay, but what do I do with this data? What do I do with this evidence, with these reliable accounts? Is the probability of all of that evidence, given that Jesus rose from the dead, higher than the probability of the evidence given that Jesus didn't rise from the dead? If I compare those two things, I put them in a little fraction, a little ratio with each other, what's going to happen? And if that ratio is, we would say, top heavy in probabilistic terms, if the probability of the evidence given Jesus rising far outweighs the probability for the evidence if he didn't, then you're in business and you can overcome even a very, very low prior. And this, by the way, this isn't my own original observation. My mother and father have actually done technical work on this. They wrote a joint paper some years ago modeling this in probabilistic terms and going into some of the details. But that's what you have to do in the end. Because the thing about David Hume is he just sort of waved his hands and didn't bother with the details. And then he thought that he had made an everlasting check, was his sort of grandiose phrase. But that just won't wash probabilistically. You really have to get your hands dirty with the specifics of the case. And I think Christianity is more than up to the task. It's like Jesus inviting Thomas to examine the wounds. That's what Jesus says. He says, "Try me." And he's still saying that.
To those who would say, okay, so it might all be true, but we still all suffer, we all go through great agonies, and then we die. What does it mean? Why does it matter? What does it change?
Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life, and he that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live." And that verse, of course, comes from the story of the raising of Lazarus. And Jesus is speaking to Martha, one of Lazarus' two sisters. But the remarkable thing about that story is it presents the divine Jesus, but it also presents the human Jesus. And so in that verse, we have Jesus is giving Martha the great resurrection hope. But also in that story, we see Jesus is weeping. He's grieved. He's angry at death. And then when Mary comes and she says the same thing to him that Martha said, she says, Lord, if you had come, my brother wouldn't have died. Jesus is overcome with emotion, and all he can say is, where is he? Where have you laid him? So we see Jesus entering into our suffering, entering into our sorrow and our pain. But the hope of the resurrection is the sorrow and the pain and the suffering is not the end. And it's, the words of Sam from Lord of the Rings, everything sad will come untrue. And that's the promise. That's the resurrection promise. That's the resurrection hope. Everything sad will come untrue. And that's why it matters in the end. That's why it matters.
It surely requires some action on our part, though, to bring it to life.
It does. And there's a quote from Augustine that says, love God and do as you please, which somebody could read that as just a license to go out and do whatever. But I think what Augustine meant is that if you truly do love God, then in his will is your peace, to quote Dante. His will is your pleasure. So the process of being a Christian is the process of choosing God day to day, becoming more like him, because you love him, because you want to follow him. And so, to go back to Jordan Peterson, that could be a way to try to explain to him that, yes, there is work for us to do. You don't have to worry about that. There is still something for us to do, but we do it out of love for God. We don't do it because we believe that in this way we can earn heaven. That's not something we can do. That was done on our behalf. And so now it's our job to accept the gift and live in that.
Final question then. We live in an age when, despite all that we have, there's very little happiness, very little joy, very little that would indicate that happiness is a normal state of affairs. In fact, we know that there are very high levels of depression and depression medication, of mental illness, of self-harm. And I think my question would be, to close it out, what you're really suggesting, I think, is that we need hope, and there is a way to access hope.
Yes, indeed. And that was actually the message that Billy Graham gave to Winston Churchill. After the war, Winston Churchill really struggled with depression. He had a meeting with Billy Graham, who was quite young at the time. And Churchill looked at Graham and he asked, do you have any hope? I'm a man in need of hope. Can you provide this for me? And the young evangelist was sort of, intimidated, but he pulled out his Bible and he said, Mr. Prime Minister, I have a good deal of hope, and shared just a little bit of what he found in the scripture. And so I think that it's our job, like the young Billy Graham, it's our job to go out and tell the world there is hope. There is good news. That's what the gospel is at the end of the day. It's good news. It's the best possible news.
Bethel, thank you so much indeed for your time. And I wish you well as you seek to encourage people to look for that hope and pick it up.
Amen.